A key tenet of programming languages is the ability to branch to different execution paths based on a condition, and the simplest way to achieve that in JavaScript is with if-else statements. Consider the simple example of a function where, based on a passed number, we want to determine if we should store the string positive or negative within a result variable. This is where we can use if-else conditions. First off, we check if the number is greater than or equal to 0, and if it is, the result is positive. Otherwise, we are going to store the string negative and eventually return the result from our function. For an if statement, we have the if keyword followed by a conditional expression, and if that expression evaluates to a boolean true, then the if block is going to execute. Otherwise, the statements within the else block are going to execute. Let's run through this function with two simple examples. First, we pass in a value 3, which of course is greater than or equal to 0. Therefore, result is going to be positive, and that is what gets returned. If we pass in a value like -5, which is not greater than or equal to 0, is going to fall into the else block, and result is going to be negative, and that is what gets returned. Now, one thing to note about if-else within JavaScript is that the else is actually completely optional, and in this particular case, we can even rewrite this example without using an else. We utilize the fact that within the if condition, we don't necessarily need to assign to a variable that we're going to return anyways. Why not just write the return statement within if? This means that the remaining code within the nature function is not going to execute, essentially turning everything outside of the if condition into a giant else. Of course, we can also verify this by passing in the same examples of nature 3 returning positive and nature -5 giving us the string negative. An additional thing to know about if-else within JavaScript is that we can chain additional if statements joined to an else. Let's expand our example to support an additional use case of providing the string 0 when the number is equal to 0. Here, in addition to if and else, we have an else if within our function. So when the first condition turns out to be false, we do an else if and then do a check for the second condition, and if that is also false, then eventually we go to the final else statement. So if you pass in 0, the first condition is true, we get 0. If you pass in a positive number, the second condition is true and we get positive. And similarly, if you pass in a negative value, then the first condition is going to be false and the second condition is going to be false, and we eventually get back the string negative. If you only have one statement in an if or an else code block, you can actually skip using the brackets around the body, but be careful not to overuse it as it can lead to subtle bugs. So we can actually rewrite our last example to be simple if, else if, and else statements each in their own line, where the code blocks are not surrounded by curly brackets. And of course, this code is still correct. It works exactly how you would expect. Now let's talk about some of the hazards of doing something like this. Consider this seemingly harmless function that takes two values a and b. If a is equal to 1 and if b is equal to 2, then it should log out a is 1 and b is 2. And if a is not equal to 1, then it should log out a is not 1. To prove that I'm not lying to you, I will pass in a check value 1 and 2, and indeed this will log out a is 1 and b is 2. Now here's the question, if I pass in 1 and 3, what do you think it is going to log out? This will actually log out a is not 1, and that statement is clearly wrong because a is 1. What has happened here is that I lied about not lying. The else block is actually associated with the second if and not the first if. And if I format it to its correct place, you can see that the console.log statement is actually incorrect. Someone wrote poor code. The console.log statement that makes sense for this particular else would be a is 1 and b is not 2. And of course, now everything makes sense. Since JavaScript is mostly whitespace agnostic, it's a good idea to use brackets to clarify your intent. In fact, we can rewrite the original code to be much better if we use brackets, and you can immediately see that if the intent was for a is not 1 to be associated with the first if, it looks much better with the brackets in place. Another advantage of using the curly brackets within your if and else blocks is that they allow you to pass in multiple statements. For example, in this particular function, if you pass in the password abracadabra, it will print all of these lyrics on the console. If you pass in the wrong password, you get nothing. Pass in the magic word, and you get every time you call my name, I heat up like a burning flame. Let's create a different song, but this time without the curly brackets, and I'm going to lie again over here and say that this is perfectly fine. If we pass in false, we should get nothing, yet we do get everything after the first statement. Because without a code block, only a single statement is a part of the if, so the ho and let's go still execute because they are not associated with the if in any way. So my final tip for this section would be that if you do want a single statement with your if or your else, write it after the if on the same line and enter a new line afterwards, just to be very clear. A common trick that developers use when working with conditional blocks in functions is early return statements, and this can help your code look prettier and make it easier to understand. Consider a simple function called birthday that is designed to take a person object, and if a valid object is passed in and it has an age property that is not null and it has an experience that is not null, then we want to update the experience by 10 and the age by 1. Instead of this nested if, we can rewrite it into 3 simple early return statements. If there is not a person, we return. If the age is null, we return. If there is no experience, we return. And now we can be guaranteed that the person has an experience and an age that we can update. And of course, we can go one step further and combine all of these different conditions into a single if expression. If we don't have a person, or the person age is null, or the person experience is null, then we simply do an early return. Otherwise, we update the experience and the age. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, thank you for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.